over here!
Hello and welcome to the Warframe tier list. Today we're going over Banshee, and first things first, let's go over the builds. So I have three separate builds with Banshee, the first two being survival focused builds, and they are both very similar. In fact, I have the same mods on both builds. The only difference is I'm choosing different subsumes depending on the circumstances. Also, with the Gloom build, which is the first build, you can replace Augur Reach with Augur Message. If you find yourself having sustain problems, Augur Message will increase the duration, so you have to recast Silence less often, your sonar will keep spreading for longer, and the drain on Gloom itself will be slightly lower. It goes from 4.1 at max down to 3.62. Speaking of subsumes, with Banshee, I always opt to get rid of her fourth ability, Soundquake, because this ability just is never good. Yes, you can make it work in like level 30 missions, but not only is it still not that great even in level 30 missions, but in level 30 missions there's like a million other things that different frames could be doing, or even Banshee could just subsume Thermal Sunder, and it would be infinitely times better, which is why I always choose to get rid of her 4. You may be wondering why not get rid of her 1 if you're not using the augment anyway, and there are two reasons. So the first reason why I always keep her 1 is because a lot of people don't know this, but even without using the augment, which makes it strip armor, it still strips armor. It always strips 33% of enemies' armor, which means in 3 casts they will be full stripped. This isn't very useful, but it can still be useful in certain situations, for example, versus Acolytes. Speaking of Acolytes, that is the second situation where it is always useful. See, her third ability, Silence, prevents Acolytes from using their abilities, such as Malice's Magnetize Bubble, and Violence can't silence you back, which can obviously lead to you dying, as Banshee really wants to go a Shield Gate build, and if you're silenced, you can't use abilities to Shield Gate. Sonic Boom also pushes Acolytes back, so now not only can they not use their abilities on you, but they also can't melee you. Banshee completely shuts Acolytes down, making them nothing more than just a slightly tankier butcher. So because of Sonic Boom's usefulness versus Acolytes, I always keep it, and especially considering how bad the 4 is. And then of course there's Sonar, which is the ability that you'll be using the most on Banshee, and is probably why you're playing Banshee in the first place. Sonar by itself isn't that great. Okay, I'm cutting myself off here because I did a terrible job at explaining this. I don't mean that Sonar is a bad ability. I meant that Sonar on cast doesn't do anything. It applies a debuff that you then have to make use of. So I always use Natural Talent to shorten the cast time of Sonar, as otherwise it's pretty long. And what can happen is you can get in loops of spamming Sonar over and over and over again, but then you're not killing the enemies, so then you just get overwhelmed and can die. As for the stats that you want on Banshee, you really don't need efficiency, just equilibrium alone is enough to sustain. Duration is really nice, especially if you're using Resonance, which I highly recommend using Resonance on every single Banshee build, as this augment is just absolutely cracked. Range, you don't really want too much range, which limits the subsumes, because the more range you have with Silence, the worse the ability actually gets, as whenever enemies are first affected by Silence, they get CC'd. So if you have too long of range on your Silence, you'll just be wasting the CC, and you'll be lowering your KPM. So that's it for the first two builds. Oh, one more thing. Banshee only needs Brief Respite to Shield Gate. This also means that it frees up your mods on your secondary, so you have a secondary to play with that is full DPS. Alternatively, you can run 2 Augur mods, so for example, you could replace Constitution with Augur Message, and then you can run 2 Augur mods on your secondary as well, And now that frees up your aura, and then you can slot whatever you want. Growing power for more strength, holster amp for double dipping on weapon damage and increasing your breach surge sparks, or just something like corrosive projection, growing power, etc., etc. So you can play with whatever you like. The third build is a disruption focus build using sonic fracture, so the 1 full strips and 1 cast instead of 3, choosing to keep resonance, and again just sustaining with equilibrium. Subsume of your choice. If you want CC, you can go something like Ensnare, or you can go a damage buff like Nourish, Roar, or Eclipse, Zada's Whisper. All of those work. The fourth build is a theoretical pillage build. However, this requires Archon shards for multiple reasons. First, I do not think it is sustainable, and second, it does not have mod space for natural talent, so you really need extra sustain and the natural talent from Archon shards. So I never got to test this build, but it should theoretically work. Again, it just requires Archon shards. Now, moving on to the rest of the loadout. Primary is your AoE weapon of choice. Just make sure that it works well with Banshee. Certain non-explosive projectile weapons, such as the Archoplasmor, do not work too well with Banshee because sometimes it just doesn't hit the sonar, even if you aim right at it. I can only assume it's because the projectile first hits a part of the body that's protruding, and then it counts that as the hit, and then you just struggle to hit the sonar part. So just make sure whatever weapon you're using works well with Banshee. Just a few recommendations are, if you want single target, Kuva Heck or Phantasma or the Fenmore, and if you want AoE, just Bubonico, Tonkwar, Brahma, Zar. Just, normal AoE weapons. As for your secondary, I highly suggest the Sporelacer, especially if you don't need Augur mods. If you need Augur mods, I would suggest the Latum, or if you want a primer, just the Epitaph or a Nucor. Melee is of course your melee of choice. However, I was using the Praetos for the parkour velocity and the sprint speed, but again, it's free to use whatever you want. Focus School is Madurai for the 50% casting speed. This casting speed again is absolutely critical on Banshee. You want to keep this up at all times while playing Banshee. And then of course the 40% ability strength doesn't hurt either, and neither does the 30% increased physical damage. Last but not least is of course the Companion, which is just a standard Panzer build with the synth mods equipped. Now, moving on to the rankings, we'll be discussing Banshee in relation to 4 separate topics. Firstly, her KPM, secondly, her survivability, thirdly, her viability in the different game modes, and finally, how fun she is to play. All of this data is sampled from a 1-hour solo Steel Path Mott run with no Spectres, on-call, and of course no Archon shards. So now let's get started with the first topic, her KPM. So this should be fairly short and sweet. Banshee, while not having amazing KPM due to not having a DPS ability herself or a grouping tool, she does have very, very good scaling potential, and the fact that her sonar can allow you to hit literally damage cap. In fact, you can just sit there and spam it like 20 times in a row and one-shot a sister or a lich with your operator and hit damage cap with just a single shot from the wrap lock. Furthermore, her sonar provides really good team utility depending on the frame that you are synergizing with. Like, for another example, a Mirage running the Disco Ball build works extraordinarily well with Banshee. The KPM is through the roof because Mirage's Disco Ball can proc the sonar weak spots. And then on top of that, even if you don't count team synergy, just Banshee herself can utilize pretty much any weapons that are already doing good damage and just making them do even bigger absurd numbers. And if you still find yourself not doing enough damage somehow, you can just go one step further and just like run the disruption build in survival and just run like Nourish or Roar or Eclipse or Zada's Whisper, and like you will have absolutely no trouble being able to kill enemies and scaling for a very long time. And then again, like I touched on briefly earlier, with Archon Charge, you should theoretically be able to run a Armor Strip build as Banshee. The reason that you can't really run Terrify or the other armor strips on Banshee is because they kind of all require range, and again, Banshee really doesn't want range. Pillage is the only one where you can work with base range and still have extraordinarily high range. Like 100% range and 100% duration is like a 30 or 40 meter range with Pillage. It is absolutely cracked, so that's why you really want to use Pillage. I guess you could use Thero Strike if you just want to strip Eximus or Acolytes, but I personally don't like small conal armor strips. I prefer the radial ones such as Terrify or Pillage. So, although that her actual KPM isn't too great, it's pretty much average at about 90 to 100. The fact that she has really good team synergy in her kit to allow for high KPM, she just has really high scaling, and things like Breach Surge can also proc it to randomly hit damage cap. I will give her a solid A- rank for her KPM. Now moving on to the second topic, her survivability, and this is where Banshee performs really bad at, because normally when a frame has bad survivability but you have either slow or other forms of CC in your kit, silence is an option that you can run. But the problem is silence isn't that great by itself. Usually you either need extraordinarily high KPM plus silence, like for example my old Mirage build, or you need other forms of CC in the kit such as Gloom, or I don't know, like a bunch of electric procs like from Geyer or Volt or something like that, or Wisp even with a shock moat and a decent range build. But silence by itself isn't enough to let you just survive, especially if you're by yourself. So if I'm solo, I would recommend, well, if you're gonna play Banshee solo, I would recommend the Gloom build, because the Gloom plus silence is enough to give her decent survivability. Even though I hate Gloom, it is a really solid option to keep her survivability up. And if you're in a group, Banshee's survivability isn't that bad, as in a group, silence is enough to stay alive because now all the enemies aren't only shooting at you. So in a group, I would recommend the Breach Surge build as your survivability is high enough there, and solo, I would recommend Gloom if you're struggling to stay alive. That all being said, her survivability still just isn't that great, mostly due to the fact that, like I touched on earlier as well, you're using Sonar to shield gate with, and again, whenever you cast Sonar, it doesn't actively kill the enemies, it doesn't CC the enemies, so then you can just cotton loop, so you can die as her. But all of that being said, if you have Last Gasp, you should almost never fully die as Banshee, because the second that you get downed, what do? You press Last Gasp, and then you just walk around and you one-hit every single enemy with your operator. If you're using a Propa, you just throw it out, you one-shot them. If you're using a Kalamora, you just hold down left mouse button, you don't even have to aim, you one-shot all of them. If you're using a Raplack, you can just precision target the sonar spots, and you will kill them. So, although you can get downed a lot as Banshee, you shouldn't ever really die. But just due to the nature of going down a lot, I will end up giving her an average survivability rank of a B. Now, moving on to her viability. And Banshee does okay for her viability because she's never really the first pick. Like, you never really join a team and you're like, oh, I really wish we have a Banshee. But if you join a game and there is a Banshee, there is an element to it where it's nice because you'll never have to worry about not being able to kill an enemy. And silence is always good team utility, especially if nobody else has it as a subsume. Now you don't have to deal with acolytes, so nobody will just randomly die from violence, or nobody will kill themselves with a malice bubble. So she is nice to have in a party on top of, again, like I briefly touched on earlier, in specific setups, she is insane. Again, such as an example of Disco Ball Mirage plus Banshee. She's decent in every single game mode. Like, she's okay. I would say she's above average in survival just because of sonar scaling with resonance. She's even good in disruption because if you armor strip the demo and then you wait, and then you just sit there and prime it, and then you wait for it to blink and purge, as long as you have Moderite and Natural Talent buff up, you can get 4 to 5 sonar casts in, and then you can just shoot the Demolist, and it will just instantly die no matter what level it is, as long as you're using an even halfway decent build. You don't even need to be using like a high damage single target weapon like a Kuva Heck or a Fenmore or anything. Like you can just use any old weapon as long as the demo is primed and armor stripped and has 5 sonar procs, and you'll probably one-shot it. So she's really good in disruption, especially again using resonance, as it allows for good ad clearing to get keys. So I will end up giving Banshee like a B plus for her viability. She's a bit above average in every single game mode, but in the end, nothing spectacular or amazing, just solid. So moving on to her fun rank, and Banshee's pretty fun. She's kind of an in-between of a caster and a gun build. She's not too much of a caster, but you do end up casting a fair bit to keep sonar buffs up and obviously shield gaining. And then on top of that, like you'll just randomly hit 400 mils, 500 mils. I've hit damage cap a couple times just in these 2 or 3 mot runs that I did getting footage for the video. So there is an element of fun, especially since she's one of the few frames where you can freely run a secondary weapon because she doesn't need auger mods on her pistol. And to me that adds a lot, because a lot of frames you just can't run a secondary because you need auger mods, because either their survivability so bad that you have to run a shield gate setup, or well, yeah, it's just that. So just the fact that she is able to use a secondary weapon, and secondary weapons work well with her because of sonar, like the Sporelacer is amazing on her. It's just, she's just fun. And then, like I said, like you randomly hit high numbers, so it's dopamine. Just, I don't know. I will give her an A rank for her fun. In conclusion, Banshee is a B tier Warframe because B stands for Banshee. No, but Banshee is a solid all-around Warframe, and she genuinely surprised me, as I always thought that people overrated Banshee. Anytime I would look at a tier list, I would always see Banshee in B or A, and I always thought that she was just a C tier Warframe who didn't really do all too much outside of sonar, but I was pleasantly surprised.